Hello everyone, welcome to your next lesson through Gilman's Digi Bio classroom. Here we are on Unit 6, which is Reproduction and Development Continued. We're up to Lesson 4, which is Human Development, so we're going to be talking about babies. You are in a new set of Cami notes. It looks like this, and every time you have questions, I'm going to have you answer those in a separate document, but I'll tell you as we go. So here you are in your Cami notes. You're going to scroll down. That way, I'd like you to try it on your own, and we'll go over this another time, okay? So I will read these to you, though, to make it better for you. So you're due now. You're going to answer on your separate worksheet, what is the female sex cell called? This is a review. What is the male sex cell called? What occurs when these two cells join together? So we're looking for a couple one-word answers for all of these, all right? So you're going to answer those in your question 4 worksheet, and then we will go over those together tomorrow. Fertilization is the scientific term for conception. That's what that is there. And it occurs when the egg cell and the sperm cell join. So take a moment to think, where does this happen in the body? Dora the Explorer moment. Did you say fallopian tube? Very good. The fetus itself will develop in the uterus, but it gets fertilized in the fallopian tube. So, what is another name for the cells involved? So besides sperm and egg, they have another name. Go ahead, think of it for a moment, and I will type your answer. You're thinking, you're trying. Hit pause if you're not ready. They're called gametes. Both sperm and egg cells are called gametes. They're also sometimes called sex cells, so you'll see that too. All right, where does this process happen? We just did that a moment ago. Pause if you're not ready, but if you are, go ahead and type your answer. These you will answer in this document. So this process happens, fertilization occurs in the fallopian tube, and then, again, we talked about this before, but think for a moment, pause if you're not ready. What is a fertilized egg cell called? So here we go. I hope you said a zygote. And look at that. It was right below. It's right there. So the zygote contains all the information needed to produce a new human being, meaning it has all 46 chromosomes. Pause if you're still typing. Otherwise, we're going to move on. Take a moment to think through what you think gestational might mean. So look at this slide for a moment. Gestational times for different animals. Oh, spoiler alert, there it is. Gestation is the number of days an animal carries offspring in the womb from conception to birth. We have a rabbit, a small rabbit, a pygmy rabbit, takes 25 days from fertilization to birth. A caracal is 70 to 78 days, so about 2 months, a little bit longer. It's showing you the blue and pink. Each stripe represents 2 months. Together, blue and a pink stripe are 4 months, and then the yellow is how long the baby or fetus is in utero before it's born. For a gorilla, it's 257 days. If you're waiting for us, you can figure out how many months is 257 days. If you think about humans and gorillas are fairly similar. A human pregnancy is about 40 weeks, so let's find out how many days that is. So we're going to do 40 times 7 days in a week. 280, pretty close. So a gorilla is a little bit faster than a human. Did you figure out how many months 257 days is? If we call it roughly 30 days in a month, it's about 8.5 months. Sounds about right. All right, the blue whale, 360 days, a whole year. A lot of animal to grow. A giraffe is even longer, 427 through 68 days long. And the Asian elephant, 640 to 660 days. That's about 2 years. So on the side here, let's go ahead and answer. I'd like you to use your inference skills and answer these in your workbook that's separate. Okay? So I want you to try these on your own, and we'll go over those together tomorrow. So, number 1, how long does it take for bacteria to reproduce? Roughly, you can give us a range. What do you notice about the relationship between the size of the organisms and the length or the duration of their gestation? And why might this relationship be true, or why does it make sense? So, answer these in your separate doc. We will go over those tomorrow. Okay, egg and sperm. An egg is one of the largest cells in the human body. It's about the size, if you make the smallest mark that you can make with a pen or a pencil on a piece of paper, that's about the size of an egg. It's smaller even than this little period. So, a sperm cell is much smaller than the egg, and it can move. Here we have the type of cell, sperm, egg, or a zygote. I'd like you to go ahead and write a description, hit pause, write it out, and then I will write the answers for you to check. Anyone know how many chromosomes the sperm cell carries? Go ahead and write that in if you happen to know. Think about it. We just talked about 46. And if you need a sperm and an egg cell to make a complete zygote, those cells are both going to carry 23 chromosomes. So, the sperm is a small cell with a tail that can swim to the egg. It's the male gamete. It carries 23 chromosomes, and you can go ahead and draw yourself a diagram too. There it is. Okay, that's not really the most accurate sperm, but it's better than nothing. Try your best. All right, the egg. Go ahead and try your description of the egg. Okay, the egg is a larger cell, still small, it's just a cell, that is released from the ovary into the fallopian tube. So the egg can't move on its own. But we are going to learn later this week or next week that the egg can get pushed along the fallopian tube. So we'll talk about that later. The fallopian tube does the work, but the egg kind of rolls along and then the sperm swims to it. So the larger cell that is released from the ovary into the fallopian tube, how many chromosomes do you think this contains? Think about it. It's the female gamete. Also carries 23 chromosomes. There we go. So 23andMe, the total of 23 and 23 is our number 46, our magic 46. That's the number of chromosomes in a complete human cell. And a zygote is the very first time that that cell has all of the chromosomes it needs to develop into a full organism. So we'll write that down. Now, if you want to, I'll draw a diagram of the egg as well. It's going to be easier to draw. It's just a circle. If you would like to go ahead and start your description of zygote, you can do that. And if you haven't dropped in a diagram of an egg cell, whoa, that's a big one. Not that big. Here we go. Actually, in relation to the sperm, they're probably more like this. So that is the sperm. This is roughly the egg size, but we'll make it smaller just so it fits in the box. And you'll see a better animation of this in a video next week. Okay, our very basic diagram. So our zygote, go ahead and type your answer for zygote if you haven't yet. A zygote is the complete cell with how many chromosomes? Good, 46. Hope you said 46 at home. Complete cell with 46 chromosomes that will develop into first an embryo, that's the first stage after a zygote, and then a fetus into an embryo. Whoops. Then a fetus. So a zygote is a fertilized egg. I'm going to put that first, actually. Remember, a fertilized egg is the egg that now contains the DNA, the genetic material from the sperm. So the egg had 23, the sperm had 23 chromosomes. They come together, they are called a zygote. When it actually fertilizes, they're a complete cell now with 46 chromosomes, and that can develop into an embryo, which then becomes a fetus, which becomes a person. Okay, so here are the 3 stages of development in order. Sometimes you'll see germinal, that means zygote. So this is stage 1. We'll write a 1 there. It's 0 to 2 weeks. It's only called a zygote really for a week or 2. Then it's called an embryo from weeks 3 to 8, so the first 2 months after those first couple weeks. And then it's called a fetus after that. So really beyond month 2, it becomes a fetus. So those are the 3 stages of development. You've probably heard before that there are 3 trimesters. When people are talking about people who are pregnant, they talk about the trimesters. That is splitting the gestational stage into 3 sets. So the first trimester really includes the zygote, the embryo, and a month of being a fetus. After that, that's more to do with how the mother's body is reacting, more so than the fetus itself. So when we're talking the 3 stages of development, we're not talking about the 3 trimesters. We're talking about zygote, embryo, fetus. We're talking about fetal development. Stage 1 of the development is called the zygote. So after that egg gets fertilized, the zygote divides into 2 cells and then continues to divide into 4, and then 8, and then 16, and then 32 until it eventually forms a hollow ball of about 100 cells. So the zygote stage is really only the first week of pregnancy. Go ahead and think for a moment. This is you're going to answer this in your workbook too. Where does that zygote implant? Because that's a review question. So once that zygote has divided enough times, it's about 100 cells, it forms a hollow ball of those cells. So it really makes like a loop of cells like that. And those cells reach the uterus. The ball then attaches itself to the lining of the uterus, also called, we talked about it last unit, or last lesson, we call that the endometrium, or the uterine lining, all mean the same thing. It takes about 3 to 4 days to actually implant. So remember, that egg gets released through ovulation either out of the ovary on either side into the fallopian tube. If the sperm swims up and meets the egg in the fallopian tube, it will fertilize. It will then travel by mostly fallopian tube pushing it and implant into the lining of the uterus. So that takes about 3 or 4 days. Here's a nice diagram if you want to zoom in. That's the relationship. There's a sperm and there's the egg, so you can see the size. And then you'll see, look, the sperm, if you can, we'll zoom in here. The sperm has its 23 chromosomes in its nucleus, which is there. The egg has 23 chromosomes in its nucleus, and then when they come together, we have that fertilized egg of 46 chromosomes. So there's our zygote. Stage 2, now it's an embryo. So if you zoom into this diagram, after about 20 days, it's 3 millimeters long. So 3 millimeters is not even half of a centimeter. So depending on your screen size, this cursor that looks like a little pen tip is actually probably about 3 millimeters large on a regular size computer. So this whole thing is smaller than that, or about that size. That's 20 days, so about 3 weeks in. And you can see it's starting to develop its head. This umbilical stalk will turn into the umbilical cord over here. It develops an eye and an arm. That tiny little thing will be its arm after about a month. Then you can see it starts to be a bit more human looking after about 8 weeks, so 2 months. And then after 12 weeks, so that's 4 months, After 12 weeks, that's 3 months, you can see that it's starting to develop arms. It has a face with an eye. You can see maybe behind its arm there's a nose. And it's 6 centimeters long. So your thumb is probably about 6 centimeters long. So after 12 weeks, it's about the size of your thumb. From the 2nd week of pregnancy through the 8th week, so the first 2 months really, the developing human is called an embryo. So tissues and organs begin to develop through the process of differentiation. So think for a moment, we learned about differentiation or specialization back when we talked about the different types of cells your body has. So you're going to answer this in your workbook. Again, we'll go over this in class together, but you're going to try it first in your workbook. What types of differentiated or specialized cells can you think of in your body? I will give you a hint. We've had some whole units about these. Let's see if I can draw you a better diagram. Maybe something that looks like there's some other things coming out this side. Okay, so what types of differentiated or specialized cells do you have in your body? Remember, if someone's a specialist, they focus on one specific job and they have some training in it, all right? So tissues and organs develop through that process of differentiation or specialization, meaning they start as the same. They start as something called stem cells. We're going to add this to the slide. Before they differentiate, they're called stem cells. And then they differentiate into their specific types. Okay? So the little circle cells that we've been looking at in diagrams all year, those are diagrams of stem cells. So what happens during the second stage? And we're going to have a video that goes through all of this in nice detail as well. So if this is going fast and you're not feeling like you're getting it just from me talking, that's okay. We'll spend some more time on this. So these words, the blastula, crossed it off. The blastula, a gastrula, which does gastrulation, and then the gastrula stage are all parts of the embryo, or the embryo developing. So the blastula stage is this ball of cells. The zygote, that was our original fertilized cell, has divided into two separate sections. So it's got an inside and an outside. The inner group of cells will become that embryo. The outer layer of cells will eventually protect and nourish that embryo, and the placenta begins to form, which we'll talk about on a later slide. From the blastula, those cells move into the center and they do something called gastrulation. So now, for a moment, think about the word gastrointestinal. Think back, what unit was that from? Or you might be thinking about how you're hungry, so your gastric juices are churning. Any guesses? Gastric is your stomach. So your digestive system is actually the first body system that forms. So gastrulation, the outer layer of that blastula, those cells that are now lined up in a sphere, folds in and it's going to create 3 different layers of cells. The inner layer is going to become your digestive system, the gastrointestinal tract. Then the top layer, called the ectoderm, so ecto meaning outside, derm meaning skin, is going to form your skin, nervous system, eyes, and other connective tissues. The middle layer, called the mesoderm, meso means middle, derm means layer, becomes the circulatory system, so your blood vessels, your bones, your muscles, and your reproductive organs. The inner layer, called the endoderm, forms your lungs, intestines, and bladder. So that was a lot. We are going to practice with this more in the next video as well. Second stage continued. The third week after conception, meaning fertilization, the brain, spinal cord, heart, let's put a comma there, and major organs begin to develop. So this is where the real important part of developing organs happens. At this stage, the baby is the size of a pen tip. So if you have a pen near you, we're talking just the little gold part where the ink comes out. About the size, actually, of, depending on the size of your computer, about that big. In week 4, the baby's heart begins to pump blood. So it's pumping its blood even after 4 weeks when, remember, it's still, how big was it after 4 weeks? After 4 weeks, it was 7 millimeters. So it's still smaller than a centimeter. So smaller than your thumbnail. And it starts to pump its own blood, which is pretty amazing. All right, stage 3. This is when it's called a fetus. So this is from the end of the 8th week, after it was an embryo, all the way through the end of pregnancy until childbirth. So months 3 through 10, roughly. The developing human is called a fetus. By the end of the first trimester, which is week 12, the sex can be distinguished, so male or female, based on the organs that the doctor can see through the ultrasound. So you can't tell what the chromosomal makeup is or the hormonal makeup or anything like that, but you can see external organs. The fetus has recognizable body features, and major organs continue to grow and develop. So that's really the bulk of the fetal development, is all considered stage 3, even though it's about 7 months long. All right, so here's what happens during the 3rd stage. So this is where the most baby growth happens. The fetal stage begins at the end of the first trimester. It lasts from week 8 to birth. So we call it 9 months. It's really about 10 if you include the week or 2 before the mother maybe has even noticed, while her menstrual cycle pauses because the zygote has implanted in the wall of the uterus. That people don't typically know they're pregnant during that stage, but it's included in this 10-month count. Around 12 weeks, the fetus develops sex organs while bones and muscles form. Movement inside the uterus occurs shortly after. So that's movement inside the uterus is what a mother could possibly feel after about 12 weeks. So 9 weeks, the fetal stage begins. You can see it's a little teeny thing right there. 12 weeks, we have our sex organs differentiate, the external organs. 16 weeks, fingers and toes develop, so 4 months in. 20 weeks is when hearing begins. 24 weeks, the lungs start to develop. 28 weeks, so about a little bit more than halfway through, the brain starts growing rapidly. 32 weeks, the bones start to develop more. This says fully develop. We've talked about this in class as well. So fetuses are newborn babies have a lot of cartilage that will develop into bone as they get older and stronger. 36 weeks, so almost near the end, the muscles start to develop, and then a full-term pregnancy is considered 40 weeks, but it's also considered full-term typically, even if the mother gives birth about 2 weeks early, it's no longer considered premature after about 38 weeks. And there's variation in everyone, so you can be born earlier and be perfectly healthy, you can be born later and be perfectly healthy, it just depends on how developed the fetus is when it's born. Okay. So, we were here in months 6 through 9, so the 3rd trimester typically. The organs continue to develop and become functional, so the heart is pumping through the fetus's body. The kidneys are filtering waste. The brain is starting to develop, which is why hearing can happen. And then we'll talk about breathing because that's a little bit different. That'll be coming in the next couple slides. The brain gets larger. Fat forms a layer under the skin, so that helps for insulation and cellular communication, meaning cells talking to each other. And the digestive system begins to work independently, meaning... All right, this you will find in your workbook because I'd like you to try these on your own. So, go ahead, answer these in your workbook. This is a Regents question, so sometimes they'll show you a diagram like this. It's pretty simple, pretty basic, and you get to figure out what's happening at each stage. So you should recognize what A and B are at this point. B and C look the same, but notice this arrow between them. So think of this as a math problem. It was A plus B led to C, so that'll help you out. This one's unlabeled. D, you can see these cells have divided. This is, if you scroll up, you'll see something familiar right around here. Take a look at this diagram and then go back to the question if you're stuck. And then E was part of that previous diagram. So the question for you, between which 2 letters, you're going to answer this in your workbook, between which 2 letters does differentiation, we saw that word before, the specialization of cells occur? So is it between A and B? Is it between B and C? Is it between C and D? Or is it between D and E? Scroll back up if you're lost or stuck. Which letter is considered the zygote, A, B, C, D, or E? And which letters are considered the gametes? So you're going to have 2 for this one. 2 answers. Oh, that did not look like a 2. A and B and C, C and D, or D and E. Answer those in your workbook. We'll go over those together tomorrow. So, take a look at this diagram. This was one of the earliest studies on something called homologous embryology. Say that 10 times fast. So, the prefix homo means same. So if you have heard of like a homogeneous mixture or a homogeneous population, that's a group of people who have things in common. They're same. Embryology is the study of embryos. So this is comparing the similarities among embryos. So now we have to take this diagram with a grain of salt because this was doctored a little bit by the person who drew it to prove a point. So this is not fully accurate, but you can still see there are plenty of similarities. So make some observations below. Describe the similarities and differences. You're going to do that in your workbook as well. Just what do you notice? So this is showing you that this is phase 1. Let's see if it'll let me draw 2. This is phase 2, and this is phase 3. So a fish, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. A salamander, a tortoise, you can see its little shell, a chicken, a pig, a cow, a rabbit, and a human. All right? So I want you to know that this is not completely accurate. This was doctored to prove a point, but just make some observations because there are some similarities. We'll go over that tomorrow. Okay, next stage. How is the embryo protected and nourished? So this is a very important thing if we are humans and we want to continue the population, or for any mammal that gives birth this way. So we need this embryo or fetus to be protected for its gestational period. So the membranes and structures that form inside the uterus during pregnancy protect and nourish the developing fetus. So there are a few parts. There's the amniotic sac that surrounds the embryo, and it's filled with fluid. It's not quite water. There's a lot of nutrients in that fluid. There are cells that are helping the fetus develop. But I'd like you to answer in your workbook what you think that fluid is for. So here it's illustrated in blue. Why might that be there? So think it through. We'll talk about it tomorrow. Placenta is another part. So here in this diagram, the placenta is on top. The placenta is not always on top. It just depends on how the mother's body develops during the pregnancy. But the placenta is a membrane which links the embryo and the mother. So the mother's blood vessels are next to the embryo's blood vessels. So all of this obviously is the mother. This is a side view, so you can see from our reproductive system. This is the uterus. There's the bladder. Here's the vagina, the birth canal. And then here we have the spine, and that's the end of the digestive system, actually. So the fetus is in the uterus. The intestines and the other organs actually get pushed up on top of the fetus. But again, that's a slow process because this takes about 6 months before the fetus starts really taking up that much room. So the mother's blood vessels are next to the embryo's blood vessels. The blood of the mother, this is important, so I'm going to figure out how to highlight it for you. The blood of the mother and the fetus does not actually mix. So substances are exchanged from one bloodstream to the next through a process that you're familiar with, and we'll go through these questions in a second. But the blood of the mother and the blood of the baby, the fetus, do not actually end up mixing. So you're going to answer these in your workbook. I'm going to write that there for you. So try these in your workbook. Which substances are passed to the fetus? So think about the 4 things. Don't forget about wastes. That would be passed from the mother to the fetus and then from the fetus back to the mother. So that's part 2. So remember, the fetus is not breathing inside the uterus. Its lungs don't work yet. And it's also not, quote, peeing inside the mother. So its waste is all being passed back through the bloodstream of the mother. So think about the specific substances that are passed from the mother to the fetus, and then the specific substances that are passed from the fetus back to the mother, who then can excrete the waste for the fetus. And our favorite process, which process is this exchange using? Go ahead, write that there. We'll go over it through your workbook. Lastly, you're also going to do this in your workbook. How would the fetus be impacted if the mother, for example, smoked, drank alcohol, or took drugs? Go ahead, answer that in your workbook. We'll go over it tomorrow. All right, next we have the umbilical cord. In this diagram, it's very long, and it's connecting the fetus to the placenta. Here's a zoomed-in version of that, and you can see it's rich in blood vessels because this is going to pass a lot of nutrients between and other substances between the mother and the fetus. So it's a rope-like structure. It doesn't have nerves, so that's why when they cut it after birth, it's not painful. That part's not painful. So it's a rope-like structure that begins to form between the embryo and the placenta. It contains blood vessels that link the embryo to the placenta, and then that can link, again, act as a diffusive surface to the mother, so the blood doesn't mix. So go ahead and write why it's necessary for a cord to connect the placenta to the embryo. Why do embryos need that umbilical cord? Answer that in your workbook. Think it through, and we'll go over that tomorrow. All right, we've gone through this in class as well because you guys were very curious about this, but multiple births, so twins and triplets. Recap, think back, what was the role of the placenta? Again, if you haven't written that, that's okay, we'll go over it tomorrow. So we have identical twins. Here's our fancy word for it, and you'll understand these words now. Mono, what does the prefix mono mean? I hope you said one. So monozygotic, that's one zygote. So that was one zygote that split into cells before it even started developing beyond the zygote stage. And so those two cells they started as one egg, they got one sperm cell, they split in half, they had identical sets of the DNA. Those will become identical twins, and they share the placenta. Fraternal twins, we call it dizygotic. So di, that prefix often means two. Two zygotes. So that was two separate egg cells that got fertilized by two separate sperm cells. They both develop and they have their own placenta. So identical monozygotic twins have the same exact DNA, and they came from the same egg and the same sperm. Fraternal twins, this is why they look like siblings and not twins, they have different DNA. So biologically, they are no different from siblings, but they were in the womb in utero at the same time. They had different eggs, different sperm. So how can we remember which is which? Give yourself a little memory hook in the workbook. That rhymed. And we will talk that through tomorrow. Okay, so our favorite test, the Regents, likes to give us different diagrams that look wildly inaccurate, and we have to recognize the pretty diagrams and the ugly diagrams. So this is, believe it or not, that is a uterus, and that's an amniotic sac around a fetus. Go ahead and label the parts of the female reproductive system, I just gave a couple away, during the gestational period below. So label number 1 is pointing to not this. Number 1 is supposed to be above the vagina. Okay, so figure out what 1 is, what it is above the vagina. Number 2 is this. Number 3 is pointing to this structure. Ooh, that was cool. That is 3. 4 is this, and 5 is this whole bubble. Okay, so here are your word bank. You have umbilical cord, placenta, cervix, amniotic sac, uterus, and also oviduct, which you know is something else. You can do numbers under those, or you can type the words in your Cami on top of that. And we will go over these from your workbook. And where does fertilization take place? You can say a number, you can say a word. Again, this is in your Cami notes, but we're going to have a version of this for you in the workbook. So answer this in the workbook too. All right. So you will answer these in your workbook. So here you have the 3 stages just in one place for you. Gestation is the part where the fetus is in utero and developing inside the uterus before it's born. Labor, we talked about the positive feedback mechanisms of labor in the fall. So take a moment to remember that. But it was a positive feedback mechanism of a hormone called oxytocin. So as the fetus's head pushes against the cervix, oxytocin gets released. The more oxytocin that's flowing through the mother's body, the more her brain tells her body to produce and release more oxytocin. And the more oxytocin, the more the cervix dilates. So we'll add which causes the cervix to dilate. Remember, the cervix is the opening between the vagina and the uterus, which acts as a gate. So the cervix expands when it's time for birth. It dilates to about 10 centimeters, so about the size of your fist. And then delivery is the actual birth part, and then you end up with a very cute baby like that one. Okay. So I'll write some notes in there. So gestation is development inside the uterus. So that's the 40 weeks. We call it 9 months usually, but it's 10 months approximately. Labor is the positive feedback mechanism of the hormone called oxytocin, which causes the cervix to dilate. Also contractions, that's really the biggest part of labor. And delivery is the actual birth of the baby. Go ahead and read this passage either to yourself or I will read it to you. We have in 1977, Dr. Patrick Steptoe and Dr. Robert Edwards had been working for years on an experimental procedure called in vitro fertilization. Their goal was to help women who could not become pregnant naturally. In vitro fertilization begins with retrieving an egg from a woman. The egg is placed in a lab dish along with sperm. If the egg is successfully fertilized, it's then placed back into the woman's body to grow into a baby. After many trials, the first in vitro baby was born on July 25th, 1978. Her parents named her Louise Joy Brown. You're going to answer them in your workbook, and we will go over them, but you are also finishing those slides on in vitro for Monday. At what point during the in vitro fertilization process is the egg placed back into the woman's body? And this one's more of a reflection question. How has in vitro fertilization impacted the world? Okay, so when you finish these, make sure in your workbook you have all of your answers completed. Hit turn in Google Classroom and we'll go over those questions tomorrow during our class time. Thank you.